Morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. It's morning here. I'm in London. It's a lovely sunny morning. I've actually had to close my blinds because it's so sunny that it was blinding me. And I'm very excited to talk to you today. I thought before I started it would be a good idea to introduce myself. So I spent 11 years in the classroom teaching primary school, where I realized I had a huge passion for teaching computing. In 2014, in England, we introduced a computing curriculum, which most teachers were terrified of. And I thought all my dreams had come true because it was all the stuff I was really passionate about. I was very, very fortunate back then in 2014 to go on a training course provided by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, which made me a Raspberry Pi certified educator and got me even more excited about teaching computing. And I realized that there weren't that many primary school teachers as excited as I was. So eventually in 2016, I left the classroom. I still do visit classrooms on a semi-regular basis to support schools with computing, with digital technology, and just making the most out of curriculum using computers. So I am also a CAS master teacher, which is Computing at School, a UK group. Basically, it means I know stuff about computing. And a Google certified innovator coach and trainer. That's my other hat. I do a lot of work with Google. And then in the context of Cambridge University Press, I am the author of the stage 4 to 6 teacher resource book, which means I've spent a lot of time writing about computing, hopefully for you lot, for teachers, so you enjoy it. And one thing I like to say, particularly to children, is that I am a certified geek. And I say that because I think it's really important to smash stereotypes when we're doing computing. We were talking earlier about how computing quite often has this traditional image of being very boring and very sort of blue and grey. That was the word we used. Whereas we're trying to make computing interesting for everyone. We're trying to make it fun and exciting. And it is, I think, for somebody who grew up in a time before the internet, it's really exciting to see how quickly things are changing. So that's just a little bit about me. You can find me on Twitter. My name is my Twitter handle at Lamin, and I talk a lot of rubbish. Sometimes about the work I do, sometimes about how I'm feeling. So don't feel obliged. And yeah, that's me. We've mentioned before that we're going to be looking at a few things today. What is computing? A bit of blended learning, a bit of unplugged and plugged learning, supporting ESL learners, common misconceptions, digital literacy and online safety. And then I'm just going to run through one of the activities from the teacher resource book I worked on, just to show you what kind of thing you can expect. Okay, so before we go any further, I wanted to ask you a little question and find out what stage of primary or lower and secondary computing you teach, because I'm conscious that there'll be people who teach different age groups. I tended to teach stage 5 and 6, but occasionally I taught stage 1. In some of my other work, I teach maths, so I teach lower secondary, in fact, I teach all the way up to upper secondary in maths because I love maths. Oh, wow, it's a nice even mix. Goodness. And I can see there are some people who teach more than one stage. And yeah, I used to have to teach sometimes stage 1 to 6. That is, wow, that is almost a perfectly even mix. Amazing. Yeah, so it's always interesting just to see what people are doing. So it looks like most people are teaching at least 2 key stages, at least 2 stages there. I can see from the fact that we've got sort of 60 in each category. Thank you for letting me know. I think we'll move on from there. And I think you can close down the poll if it's in your way. So when we teach computing, when we're doing the work from the books, from the teacher resource books and the learner books for computing, we split it into 4 strands. You can see here computational thinking and programming, managing data, networks and digital communications, and computer systems. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about is why. Why do we teach computing? Why is it so important? And I think it really is important. I mentioned before, when I was young, we had 1 computer in the school. And now most schools have, if not individual devices, certainly a class set of devices. There are computers everywhere for students. But more importantly, in the workplace, there are very few jobs that don't involve some element of computing, from fashion to farming, I always say, because now clothes are designed on a computer, crops are monitored with drones. Computers are ubiquitous, they are everywhere we go. And it's really important, I think, that we shift a mindset from being simply consumers of technology to creators of technology. So I want to see students, I want to see learners thinking about shifting from just consuming it to using it effectively, and then ideally becoming creators. And that's sort of the way we've developed this work, so that we're thinking a little bit more about how to use technology effectively. So you'll see those 4 strands. The sort of, for me, the biggest one is that computational thinking and programming, where we think about what is computational thinking, and that is logic puzzles. That's solving things in a logical way, developing algorithms, which leads into programming, using Scratch, using Python, using various different programming tools. And that's quite a big chunk. And unfortunately, what certainly happened here in England is when the computing curriculum changed, the focus fell onto that computational thinking and programming and didn't move beyond it. So everyone thought it was all about just writing programs. But actually, there's so much more to computing. So you can see we've got managing data. And of course, gut instinct, you think, oh, okay, that's just spreadsheets, that's boring. But it's not. It's really interesting. It's all about how you collect data, the different types of data, how you can manipulate data, what you can do with data, and gets linked to the real world, and talking about how industries use data to develop their tools. I think it's really interesting the way it sort of builds so much bigger beyond what you think traditionally. And then networks and digital communications, understanding both how a small network within a school might work and how the internet works in the wider world, and even how mobile communications build into this whole networks and digital communications. But on top of that, there's an element of how do you keep things safe in this digitally connected world, how passwords work, how we can make sure that data is safely transmitted with passwords, even things like how packets work, all those little details. It's really, really interesting. And then computer systems is understanding how computers themselves work, understanding the components, understanding inputs and outputs, and even bits about artificial intelligence and how that's moving things forward, how that's developed, what we even mean by that. And one of the things I love about the way we've developed this scheme is we've sort of managed to get that line between supporting teachers who already know this stuff, but also helping for teachers who aren't confident and do need to learn this for the first time. Because quite often the case is that as a teacher, you're teaching a subject you're not necessarily that comfortable with. And it's really nice that there's elements for everybody in there, both teachers and students. So thinking about those 4 strands that I've talked about, I want to know which you are least confident in teaching, because it's always interesting to say which of the 4 strands: computational thinking and programming, managing data, networks and digital communications, or computer systems. For me, I would always say managing data, just because I don't really know. It's my weakest subject of the 4. I love them all, but I don't think I'm that confident with spreadsheets. I love teaching computational thinking and programming because you can have a lot of fun with it. And to be honest, I actually quite enjoyed some of the work we did in networks and digital communications around passwords. And we did a bit around not Morse code, pigpen ciphers and Caesar ciphers and all of that kind of thing. It's just the sort of fun you can have with that kind of situation. I can see there are quite a few people with me on the managing data. But yeah, and often teachers are worried about computational thinking program because that is an unfamiliar topic. For people of my generation who were brought up in the 80s, we did have things like the BBC Micro to learn to program, but I certainly felt that it was marketed at boys. So for me to want to program as a woman, it wasn't necessarily something I felt comfortable doing. And so I've learned it all as an adult. I've learned it all most of it since 2014. I would say prior to that, I knew a tiny bit of HTML, which isn't really a programming language even. But now I have learned how to use Scratch. I've learned enough Python to be able to teach it. I've learned various different things. I know how it all works because I'm interested in it, because I think it's interesting. I'm going to finish that poll now and move on. But thank you all for sharing. It's really nice to see the mix of different things that people are least confident with. And hopefully, if you do end up with the teacher resource book, there is enough information there to help you feel supported. Oh, my computer's making fun noises. So when we teach computing, it's easy to assume that everything is done on a computer, but actually one of the things that we always do is do a lot of work around unplugged and plugged learning. And by unplugged, we mean doing stuff away from the computer to help learn it. We talk a little bit about this idea of a semantic wave. So you learn the top level stuff and then you sort of go to low level metaphors before fully understanding it. And that's where we use the unplugged learning to get your head around what's actually going on. So for example, some of the unplugged activities include navigating around a maze to understand algorithms. So you explain, the learners need to explain how they get their robot to move around the maze, even though they're not touching a computer at any point. And that can be used then to explain basic algorithms, forward, left, right, or to introduce loops or even conditional statements. If you see this, then do this. We introduce subroutines and procedures as you move higher up the work. And so we've incorporated a dance. So, a repeated part of a dance could be a subroutine that the students have to learn. And then in terms of the networks and digital communications, we can create a paper map of the school's network. You don't touch the computer to do that. You walk around, you find all the different things if you've got them. If not, you'll have to talk about them and where they might have been historically, because some schools don't necessarily have a network, although most schools will have a wireless network now. And things that I mentioned this before, written ciphers and how they link to security and password protection. I have to admit, I am a massive geek when it comes to ciphers. I love exploring different types of cipher. In stage 4, we specifically look at Pigpen and Season. You can see the Pigpen cipher on the picture there. And also, just for reference, these 2 characters are featured throughout the learners' books, and the students become familiar with them as they move through. My mind's gone completely blank on the names. I want to say Sophia and Zara, but I might be wrong. But they are throughout the learner's book to help students, and they're different. They look different depending on which stage you're working with. So it's really nice to have that continuity. So one of the other things we've mentioned is supporting learners who aren't speaking English as their first language, so supporting English as a second language learners. And of course, that was in everyone's mind while we were writing, to keep the language as simple as possible. And we've made sure in the teacher resource book, there is clear language goals at each stage and each unit. So you can see, for example, here, there's a language support piece about thinking aloud. So it's just gives you some suggestions of ways you can incorporate language support just generally in your teaching. In each activity, we try, or in each sort of unit, we try and include lots of speaking and listening activities to give the students, give your learners a chance to talk, because we know that talking helps to clarify understanding, as well as vocabulary reviews. So there are activities, for example, create a mini guide to the core vocabulary, create a poster about this vocabulary, explain this vocabulary to your parent as homework, parent or carer as homework. So we're really conscious throughout the scheme, throughout the books, to support students and learners who aren't necessarily speaking English as their first language. So hopefully that's useful information. Now, as we move through, there is specific software that is mentioned. Sometimes alternatives are suggested where possible. So I'm just going to run through. So in stages 1 and 2, we recommend that learners use Scratch Junior, which if you've not seen, it's an app. It's available on various devices. It's on the Play Store, it's on the Apple App Store. And it's a really nice, simple introduction to programming, very linear, very basic. And then in stage 3, we introduce Scratch, which you can access anywhere you've got access to the internet. There is a downloadable app version of Scratch, depending on how you want to manage it. And then we've got some lovely physical computing using microbits in stage 1 to 3, which are hardware devices. I'll talk a bit more about them in a moment. And then Bebots. So if you've not seen the Bebots, the little floor robots that beep around, and there are virtual versions of Bebots we can suggest and things like that if you don't have the physical hardware. And then Google Forms and Microsoft Excel. Both of those have alternatives you can use. So for example, if you are a Google user, you could use Google Sheets it's very similar to Excel. You can do alternatives. If you are a Microsoft user, you can use Microsoft Forms. It's very similar to Google Forms. You can very easily change the plan to suit that. And then when we move into stage 4 to 6, we again use Scratch and microbit. So just to clarify with the microbit, it is a small piece of hardware. It costs about £15 to buy, and that includes cables, batteries, all the bits you need to operate it, but you don't need microbits. The microbit website provides an emulator, so you can do it all on the screen. But I believe, as a computing teacher, that it's important to physically have devices where possible, because that gives learners the opportunity to understand that computers move beyond just a computer. Computing involves robotics. It involves what we call physical computing. So that microbit is a physical device. It's, you know, this big. Actually, if I go back, you can see it on the front cover of the stage 3 learners book there. It's a small physical device that the learners can do stuff to. It's got various inputs. For example, you can shake it to make an action happen. And it just creates an extra layer of excitement, I think, and an extra layer of understanding of what we mean by computing. And of course, students love scrolling their name across the LEDs on the front, because who wouldn't? Continuing back to stage 4 and 6, we also again use Google Forms, Microsoft Excel, and in stage 6 we introduce something called EduBlocks, and EduBlocks has been developed to help learners transition from Scratch to Python. So it's Scratch-like blocks, but with Python syntax on them. So that means that learners can see how Python is structured as a programming language without needing to worry about getting it exactly right. Because one of the most difficult problems when you move from what we call block-based programming to text-based programming is knowing that you've got to get things exactly right in terms of the writing, in terms of spelling, in terms of the spacing. So EduBlocks has been developed to provide that transition. And it's only really used in stage 6 and stage 7. It doesn't need to be used. So the transition activities are there, but you don't have to use them. It's just if you want to start preparing learners for what's coming next in stage 7. So it's quite valuable to have that. There's also a transition document that we've developed to help understand how to move from blocks to Python for stage 6 and stage 7 teachers. So that's included as part of the stage 6 and 7 teacher resource. In stage 7, we do introduce Python. The IDEs that we use are idle and PyCharm. There are a plethora of different IDEs you can use. And of course, if you don't want to use idle and PyCharm, you could use something else like Mu or Trinket, all those various different ones, Replit. There's endless IDEs for Python, but the two that are used explicitly in the teacher resource guides are idle and PyCharm. And then Microsoft Access, Microsoft Excel, and again, the microbits are used. So you can see that they are quite a useful investment. In fact, you can buy a pack of 10 designed for schools from Microbit. They've got resellers all around the world because they are a global company. So it's worth just popping onto their website, and they've got a section for where you can buy in your region. So that's just so you know some of the different tools and software. And as I'll just stress, you can use different software. You don't have to use what is written there. It's just that's the recommended software. That's what has been discovered to be the most useful in terms of using them in school, if that makes sense. So one of the things that we cover in each topic, so each book is split into the 4 units, which I mentioned at the beginning, and then each unit is then split further into topics. And at the beginning of each topic, we suggest some common misconceptions that occur and ways to identify and support learners. So you can see here, for example, misconception: loops can only be repeated a specific number of times. So you notice how to identify it. Learners recognize that a loop repeats an algorithm, but may feel a loop has to be defined by a number, because when we introduce loops, we talk about indefinite loops and count-controlled loops. So that idea of a forever loop versus a loop repeat 4 times, and helping learners to understand what forever means. So you'll find these common misconceptions at the beginning of every topic. So every bit within a unit has some common misconceptions. You may well be thinking, but what about how to use computers effectively beyond computing? There is a separate digital literacy and online safety framework that you can find separately, and that covers things like online safety. However, what we've embedded within the teacher resource books are ideas to demonstrate digital literacy skills. So, for example, we suggest making a physical poster on a piece of paper, or using a tool like Canva to create a digital graphic, to create a digital poster, to give learners that opportunity to share their digital literacy skills. We talk a lot about online safety. So again, embedded within the teacher resources, remind learners to keep their password safe, remind learners not to talk to strangers online, things like that, just embedded within as you go through. So while it's not explicitly taught as part of this computing scheme, there are opportunities to use those tools. You know, we talk about recording a digital audio recording similar to a podcast, and showing your understanding. So you've got the speaking and listening, but you've also got that digital literacy skill of recording and even editing if you want to spend that time. So again, really, really useful to know that that's there, that's embedded, that's underneath everything. So I'm going to sort of start rounding up now and talk through an example activity. I've chosen topic 1.3 of the stage 4 book. So this is one of the computational thinking and programming topics. And I've just picked one starter activity, one main activity, one plenary, and one homework. So every single topic has several starter, main, plenary, and homework activities, at least 2. So here is one of the starter activities, loops. You can see we've got listed there the different resource sheets you need, what the learning intention is explicitly. So in this case, it's an activity to review previous understanding of forever loops, because they will have done forever loops in the previous topic. And also just, again, predicting what algorithms do, which is something that learners will have covered prior to this in probably earlier in stage 3, as well as in this topic. So you can see there are 5 different algorithms, or 4 different algorithms presented there. There's also the source file, so that if you wanted to, you could display the source file directly, and learners are just asked to talk through what they think the programs are going to do, make a note of it, and then talk about it. And you can see at the bottom, support. If learners are finding this difficult, consider revising some of the scripts we use forever loops with in topic 1.2. So there's that reference for support. Sometimes the support might be look at a prior stage. Sometimes it might be do another activity, for example, this. All the materials are provided as both digital and physical resources. So you could just display the poster on your whiteboard, or you could print it out and provide learners with their own copies, depending on how you want to run it. We try and make sure that there's lots of options for what suits you best. It's not prescriptive. It's not you must do it this way. It's this might work for you. And then we move on to the main teaching idea, and you can see this is an unplugged robot. I mentioned that before. We have unplugged activities, and this one refers explicitly to an activity in the learner's book. Not all of the activities in the teacher resource book refer to the learner's book. Some are unique to the teacher resource book. Some are guidance and support for stuff in the learner's book. So in this case, it supports the learner's book, and it gives you some text to say, for example, ask learners, is there a way to improve this algorithm? So you can see there's specific script stuff you can use. Again, it's not you must use it, but you can use it. It will help you. And it refers to specific points in the learner book. So for example, define iteration, which is something that learners will have read in the learner's book, but also it helps you to know what the definition is. And you can see there that there are support and challenge activities. So you've got differentiation to support your whole class. And you can see a rough estimation of the time it's meant to take. Okay. And then finally, you can see here, I've included one plenary and one homework activity on the same page. So again, the plenary activities often include reflection, vocabulary review, or something explicitly relating to the content. In this case, we are consolidating understanding of programs with count-controlled loops, and also just stressing the importance of debugging by playing a game called Sabotage. So learners are provided with a program and they have to make one change, and then they have to swap with another team to try and identify what the change is. And obviously that encourages learners both to talk to their partner about what's going on, but to interpret a program, interpret an algorithm, and understand what it's meant to do versus what it's actually doing. And then for homework activities, as a general rule, there's usually at least one unplugged activity so that learners can complete it at home if they don't have access to computers. But occasionally there are ones that could be done online. We often include activities that involve discussion with parents or caregivers, again, to reinforce that vocabulary, but also just to reinforce conversations with family at home. So in this case, it's a reflection on language as the homework activities. So they have to find a word that they found particularly difficult and create some sort of visual reminder. And sometimes, again, we say here, you can, so sometimes an activity like this might say, display the learner's homework in your classroom to help reinforce the language. So it's there, visible, easy for them to see. I realize I'm rattling through this at the speed of sound. So we have already got to the questions section. Hopefully that's been really useful for you.
Thank you, Kat. It was very interesting. I found it very interesting, definitely. Thank you for that excellent presentation. I'm sure our audience found it useful too. As Kat said, it's now time for our Q&A. So if you have a question that you'd like answered, make sure you post it in the Q&A box before the end of the session. Now, I can actually see that we're waiting for some questions to come through. So I have some questions that I'd like to ask, if that's okay, Kat. So as part of the podcast that I mentioned, we gathered some questions from teachers around the world. And one of them was about technology and the fact that it's constantly changing and evolving. So I'd like to ask you the following question. Which computing concepts do you think are important for learners to know in a constantly changing technological landscape?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So that idea of computational thinking is really core to all computing. It goes right back to Ada Lovelace. Everybody needs to use computational thinking. We quite often split it up into the idea of now I've forgotten my gosh, my brain's gone completely back. Well, we split it up into 4 strands to help learn it. But to me, computational thinking is basically problem solving, and it can be applied beyond computing. And it's about the structure. Then looking more detail about programming, no matter how you program, no matter what you do, those core concepts, for example, understanding loops or iteration, understanding conditional statements, understanding what an algorithm is, that's not going to change. No matter what else changes, that's not going to change. If you look at something like data handling, it's a really fascinating topic because things like AI are being introduced more and more into data handling. So for example, if you do Google Forms, when you use Google Forms, when you collect the data, it uses AI to present the data you've collected in pie charts and tables when you're doing it. And I think that is an area that will continue to develop. But at the end of the day, you still need to understand what data is in order to be able to understand what the computer is interpreting. So I think understanding the fundamentals, understanding the background behind everything can help you understand the future when you think about it. Because we are in this constantly evolving environment. The jobs that exist today didn't exist 10, 20 years ago. So if you can understand the background, if you can understand what's happening, then you can help move forwards. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. There's definitely this foundational knowledge that you need to have before you can then explore, I guess, the stuff that's constantly changing as well. Thank you for that, Kat. We do have some questions coming in now, and this is an interesting question that I've actually seen come up a couple of times with teachers. But the question is, how do I introduce computing topics to children in class 1, so stage 1, those very new learners that perhaps haven't even thought about this before?
So I didn't work on the stage 1 book, but I'm going to go on my own experience. Actually, funnily enough, I was teaching a year 1 class this week. And one of the key phrases that come out quite often is digital natives, which I find quite a frustrating term. And we refer to young learners as digital natives because they're surrounded by technology. But actually what they're surrounded by quite often is an iPad that they know how to swipe and tap on. They don't actually understand computers. I think in young, those young children, they are surrounded by technology. What we're introducing to them is, again, those very, very basic skills, like how an algorithm works, very, very basic understanding that it's a linear set of rules, understanding how data is collected. It's quite often linked back to personal experiences, and it's understanding that computers are everywhere. So learners are basically surrounded by computers in stage 1. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Kat. Thank you. We also have a question about the unplugged activities that you mentioned earlier. So what are the benefits of these unplugged activities for learners?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Trying to challenge me today, Georgia. The idea behind unplugged activities is to sort of create these metaphors and create parallels so that students can understand in a much more physical way what's going on. So if you map out a network, you can visualize how the computers are connecting to each other. If you run a dance routine to understand a subroutine, it's creating that parallel to a real world situation to help the knowledge, to help the understanding get into place. And it's just another way to get involved, get interested, and teach something.
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting one. I really like the idea of being able to explore these concepts like away from the computer as well as in front of them. And I think you're right, it definitely engages people further. And we also have, sorry, go on.
We often use computers to solve real life problems, or use technology to solve real life problems. And I think if you take it away from actually just being the computer screen, that helps create that link between real life problems almost, because you can see something you're doing physically and you can see those parallels a bit more.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. We also have a question about the PRIM approach to teaching programming. So PRIM, as we know, stands for predict, run, investigate, modify, and make. So what is PRIM, Kat, and how can it be effectively used to teach programming?
So I mentioned the Raspberry Pi Foundation earlier. Actually, PRIM is an approach developed by Sue Sentence and Jane Waite, who Sue works at Raspberry Pi Foundation now. And it's a lot of work. When they were both working for CAS, Computing at School, they developed this idea of best practice for teaching computing. And so it's a really nice approach that helps learners understand, because quite often with programming, the biggest mistake that teachers make or students make is that they dive straight into the programming, and it's like trying to write before you can read. We forget that first step of reading the program, which is why we need that predict phase at the beginning. So we need to be able to understand what's going on, and then try it and see what happens, and then you can start exploring, modifying before you can work independently. So it's just that idea of a bit of scaffolding, if that makes sense, to move things forwards.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kat. Now we have an interesting question now, and that question is, how do we combine ICT with computing teaching for lower secondary? Like, do you have any advice for bringing those both together?
So ICT is traditionally information communication technology, which to a certain extent is that digital literacy side of things. I would say that there are certainly elements of the computing curriculum that can be taught and combined with ICT and digital literacy ideas. For example, I mentioned things like creating digital posters as part of the activity. And then there's also that data handling aspect, which links very heavily with ICT. And that's one of the topics that we cover in computing. I think, I mean, certainly in England, our curriculum combines ICT as part of computing, but I know that the way the Cambridge scheme works is that there is digital literacy as a separate topic, and then the computing covers those 4 strands. So you've got a bit of ICT in both, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. The different approach is very interesting. We have a question now in relation to computational thinking specifically, and it's coming back to those earlier stages, which I appreciate, Kat, that you didn't work on that in these resources. But do you have any kind of favorite activities that you like to do at stages 1 and 2 when it comes to computational thinking?
It's a lot of unplugged activities in stages 1 and 2. You can have a lot of fun with learners. So one that I always do is ask learners to direct me around the classroom, write a program to move me around the classroom, and then deliberately do exactly what they say and crash into things and be silly about it, to get that idea that a computer has to be given very clear instructions in order for it to understand. So it's a lot of silliness, I think, and having fun with unplugged activities to get the computational thinking skills in. We talk about things like decomposition. Decomposition is breaking a problem down into smaller parts, but you can use, again, metaphors for that. So similes, sorry, it's like tidying your room. If you say tidy your room, that's a big task. If you say fold your clothes, put your toys away, and stack your books up, that's 3 smaller tasks that you've broken down into smaller problems. So you can see there, it's that unplugged parallels. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do that myself. If I have a big task at hand, I definitely try and break it down just so I feel less overwhelmed when doing it. So it's interesting that it also comes back to computing as well and computational thinking. Thank you, Kat. And so I think we've come to the end of the questions now. So thank you for all of the questions that have been submitted so far. Thank you also to Kat for taking the time to present to us today.